In today's episode, we're talking with Arizona's Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs.
So among her many duties, Secretary Hobbs ensures the election security in Arizona. She's had a lot of criticism lately and even some conspiracy theories to bat away. Today, we'll hear from her about how the 2020 elections have fared here in Arizona.
The presidential race has been called nationally for Vice President Joe Biden. But ballot counting here in Arizona is still in full swing at county recorders' offices. So far, more than 3 million ballots have been cast across the state. That's 78% of voter turnout, and that's big. As poll workers got to counting ballots, controversies and protests gained traction with voters.
Arizona proved to be one of the crucial swing states in this election, and while it was called relatively early in the process, Joe Biden's lead turned out to be a relatively narrow one in the end here. And this has created some legal consternation for the Trump campaign. It led to calls to continue the count in Arizona, even as they were asking for counting to stop in Pennsylvania. And it's worth noting at this point that there's been no evidence of fraud in any of these states. And we can't emphasize this enough. All votes are being counted.
Fellow Republicans like Senator Mitt Romney have criticized the president's approach. Romney said that without evidence, the claims of widespread fraud are destructive to our democracy. Such claims allow protesters to buy into conspiracy theories, like the Sharpie Gate theory in Arizona, while undermining fair elections and their results overall. Here's our interview with Secretary Hobbs that we recorded on Monday, November 9th. Secretary, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Are all legal votes being counted in Arizona? Let's just start with that question.
You know, it's really just, I don't even know how to respond to say that it's just crazy that you have to ask that question because that is what happens every year. We count all the legal votes. We're required to by law, and that's what we're doing.
So help us understand that, because we have actually even members of Congress from here in Arizona who are implying that somehow legal votes are not being counted, illegal votes are being counted. They are getting behind an idea that this election is somehow being stolen. What do you say to those who may be trying to make sense of this for themselves, mindful of that kind of information?
Well, there should be no question about all the legal votes being counted or illegal votes being counted. We don't have illegal votes. When people come into a polling place, they have to show ID. And if they don't have the proper ID, then they're given a conditional provisional ballot, and that ballot won't be counted until they show their ID to the county elections office, and they have until Tuesday to do that. In terms of vote by mail, then the identification is verified by the signature on the ballot, and there's a rigorous process in place to determine if those signatures match what's on file for that voter to determine the voter's identity. If those signatures don't match, there's also a cure process for that. If the signature is missing, unfortunately, that cure process ended on election day, but for mismatched signatures, those can still be cured until tomorrow as well. And then when you go into the polling place to cast your ballot, you're actually putting your ballot into the tabulator. So it's being counted right there. And so I just really, it's very frustrating that there is all of this baseless conspiracy theories about people trying to steal the election because that is just 100% not what happened. And I could go on for hours about all of the different steps in the process that are in place to ensure transparency. I think it's Congressman Gosar that's calling for all of these audits. We do all of those audits. We test the machines before and after the election. There was a hand count audit that Maricopa County, I believe, completed yesterday, but all the counties do it. It's by law, and it's initiated the day after the election, and they have 6 days to complete it. And there's public records for this stuff going back however long we keep the public records for that for every election. And we also certify all the equipment. It's first of all certified by the Election Assistance Commission of the United States, and then certified by the committee in our office before it's allowed to be a state.
And just to be clear, this is the Dominion software that we're talking about.
Well, all of it, but yes, yeah. So every tabulation machine, every ballot marking device that's utilized is certified.
So how did the pandemic change the way voters cast their ballots? How much of an impact has that had in this election as far as you can tell at this point?
Well, not only did this election see record turnout, but we saw record turnout with early vote. Arizonans have embraced voting by mail. 75% of Arizonans are on the permanent early voter list. And this year, especially, we really worked to promote voting by mail, but also put a lot of emphasis on all of the early voting options that Arizonans have. And we've always had them, but I don't think a lot of people were aware of them. We saw people showing up at early polling places that opened the first day they were allowed to on October 7th, who didn't want to wait for their ballot by mail. They wanted to vote in person. And I think that the focus there really was making sure that we spread out election day in this pandemic so that folks who were going to vote in person were able to do so in a more safe environment with less people, less crowding. And we really did see that there, as far as I could tell on election day, there weren't lines. There weren't crowded polling places. There were lines, but they moved relatively quickly. And we also really encouraged voters who were going to vote in person to be prepared so that, again, to speed up the process and make sure that folks weren't having to be in the polling place for long periods of time.
This is your first presidential election as the Arizona Secretary of State. How would you describe how things have been operating and kind of what the tenor and the environment has felt like in your office since Tuesday night?
Well, I think that where we're at right now started a long time before Tuesday. We really put a lot of emphasis on building partnership with the county election officials so that when we got to this day that things would go as smoothly as possible. Certainly there were glitches. I'm not going to say everything was perfect, but what we saw in the both the presidential preference election and the primary election in August were really smooth operations. And we had a lot of lessons that we were able to carry into this election day. And by all accounts, things went very smoothly. And I think going into this election, even before the pandemic, knowing that Arizona was potentially a battleground state, that we would be in the national spotlight, that there would be a lot of scrutiny, and there was a lot, we should always be focused on getting it right, but that national spotlight kind of added to that for sure. And then my focus has always been on ensuring that every eligible voter gets the chance to participate. And the pandemic added to that the need to make sure that they can participate without having to question that their health or safety would be compromised. So I think aside from some baseless conspiracy theories, at the end of the day, we're certainly going to do an autopsy of everything that we did and could have done better and differently, and what we want to focus on to improve for the 2022 election, but certainly feeling like we did a lot of things right.
I feel like a lot of your job involves day-to-day work that most people will never know and pay attention to closely. They pay attention for a few days every 4 years or maybe every 2 years. Help people understand why it is that the final vote totals are not known as we tape this on Monday morning. Why does this process take the time that it does?
Yeah, I think that people thought, because we can tabulate early ballots earlier, and so many of the ballots came in early, that we would be done on election night. And certainly we had a lot of vote totals on election night. All of those early ballots that were already tabulated, all of the election day ballots. And what we still had waiting for us were the early ballots that got dropped off on election day, which still had to be signature verified in order to be tabulated. And that signature verification process is rigorous, it's labor intensive, it involves humans, and it takes time. And so we didn't know going into Election Day how many of those early ballots there would be to still do that process with. And that was a large bulk of what was remaining to count after Election Day. Also, so the ballots that they're counting now, for the most part, we're going to see the rest of the results really trickling in, because these are, again, ballots that take time to process. They are large print or braille ballots, or the military and overseas ballots, or ballots that have been damaged in the mail or at someone's house when they're voting, and those have to be duplicated in order to be tabulated. And again, labor-intensive process that just takes time. And then the provisional ballots, a lot of the provisional ballots that are cast, they're either because somebody goes to the wrong polling place and they cast a ballot at the wrong polling place. That's a provisional ballot, which didn't happen a lot in Maricopa County this year, because Maricopa County had vote centers instead of polling places for the entire election. Or it's somebody they were on the list to get a mail-in ballot, and they didn't vote their mail-in ballot, or they didn't receive their mail-in ballot, or for whatever reason, and so they went to vote in person. And in Pima County, this is particularly the issue because Pima County doesn't use electronic poll books, and so they don't have the update isn't like instantaneous like it is in the other counties that use those electronic poll books, and so they can't verify whether the mail-in ballot has been received or not. And so those voters are given provisional ballots. And so all of those take time to process and see whether that ballot can actually be counted or not. And then the conditional provisional ballots, I think, as I mentioned before, they have until Tuesday to show ID whether or not those are eligible to be counted or not. And then the mismatched signature ballots have until Tuesday as well. So lots of kind of moving parts there that take a lot of just time and labor to finalize.
One note for our listeners. This interview was recorded on Monday. The deadline Secretary Hobbs mentioned for conditional provisional ballots and mismatched signature ballots have already passed. So we want to give you a chance to address this next controversial sort of question head on. Since Tuesday night, a theory has emerged that Sharpie markers were intentionally given to conservative voters in particular to invalidate their votes. Can you respond to this conspiracy theory?
Well, I kind of thought we had already put that to rest. The folks at the polling places that are giving the voters the markers to mark their ballots with are county employees, and they are supplied with their supplies by the county, and the county gave them Sharpie markers for the ballots because that's the pen recommended by the manufacturer of the tabulation machines. They dry quicker, they're not going to smear, and they're not going to cause buildup in the tabulator that down the road can make things problematic. And so they were following the manufacturer's recommendation on those pens. Maricopa County has confirmed that there were no ballots cast on Election Day that were invalidated because of Sharpie markers. And so this really was just a baseless conspiracy theory. The Attorney General weighed in. He was satisfied with the responses that came. And at this point, I don't understand why it's still an issue. Certainly, sometimes people get it. The counties, the instructions on the ballots vary by county. The counties are responsible for the ballot design and the instructions that go with the ballot. And on some ballots, if you're at home, voting at home, and you use a Sharpie, it might bleed through to the other side and cause problems with the tabulator reading the ballot. Again, it's going to depend on the ballot design. There's a process for counting those ballots. They all get counted. I mentioned the duplication boards. That's part of what they're duplicating is those ballots that the tabulator can't read. those ballots are all counted. You don't do this, but you could mark your ballot with crayon and it's still going to be counted. The machine probably can't read it, but somebody will, and they'll duplicate it and it will be counted.
So one of the other memorable parts of this vote counting period has been the protests that have been occurring outside the county's offices and such. Talk about what the effect is of those kinds of protests led by people like Alex Jones and such. Has this had any kind of impact on participation from employees or volunteers? Has this created any kind of hazards for, completing the task that you all are trying to do?
The employees are showing up. They're working around the clock. They're counting the ballots. They're doing their job. Certainly, this kind of thing is disheartening, even scary. People like Alex Jones inciting violence. And honestly, it's a distraction that potentially is going to cause delays in the process. Now they're having to worry about everyone's security in the building and getting in and out of their vehicles. And what they're calling for is to count all the ballots, and that's exactly what's happening. So in that regard, it seems more than a little bit counterproductive. And the other things, the transparency, the audits, I've already mentioned, we do all those things. And the records of all of those things are available at the public's request. And the reason we do those is to ensure the accuracy of the process and the transparency of the process. I think they're also asking for access to the building, and that is absolutely not possible, not in the current circumstances of doing all of this in the pandemic. When you're trying to have people spaced out and the space is limited. But there also is a party representative for all the parties allowed inside. And so there are people watching. The other piece of the process that I don't think a lot of people know, and this is the case for polling locations as well as in the tabulation centers, the staff are mixed in terms of parties. There's no one political party dominating. And at polling places, they're required to have a balance of Republicans and Democrats. And that's, again, how we ensure the fairness of the process. All the tabulation centers in the state also have cameras that are live broadcasting the tabulation process. And so those links are available online. They're available on our website, and they're available on each county's election website.
President Trump is being criticized from folks on both ends of the political spectrum for undermining confidence in the integrity of United States elections. You obviously don't agree with these sorts of attacks. How do you begin to rebuild trust in the process for the public after this sort of rhetoric, and how do you change the minds of people who believe it?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because this has been going on for a long time. It didn't just start on election day or the day after the election. And I think there are definitely a subset of people who, no matter what we say and no matter how much transparency we offer, and they're just not going to believe that. And I think that what's important and what we're focused on is continuing to provide the information to the public that we're providing to inform the public of what we are doing to ensure the transparency and fairness and accuracy and security and everything else that we've been doing for the last several months. And I think that that the folks who aren't going to listen are a small minority, and we're just going to continue to focus on the integrity in the process and doing our jobs to ensure that.
On a related note, do you think that the governor has done what he should do to, sort of bolster confidence that this process is appropriate, transparent, and legal and all that?
I think I've watched around the country other secretaries of state being attacked for the process in their states, baselessly attacked. And Michigan comes to mind in particular. And I think a lot of that is gender-based and political party-based as well. Those two things paired together. And I think that Arizona has been spared from some of those attacks by the president because of Governor Ducey. And he, throughout the, around the primary time up until now, has been, when asked, made statements saying that our ballot by mail process is secure and that the election is going to be secure. I think what I'm most frustrated about right now is his lack of any commentary on the incendiary protests that are happening outside of the election center here in Maricopa County. I think that, he's been silent, and there are a lot of people who have been openly critical of that silence. I think that him making a statement that doesn't infringe on anybody's First Amendment rights, but also doesn't condone the violent rhetoric would go a long way.
Have you had a conversation with the governor since Tuesday?
Our office has had staff-to-staff conversations about exactly this, and there really hasn't been any substantive response.
Presidential elections are overseen by individual states, not by the federal government overall. So this is why some states can start counting mail-in ballots before election night, while others, for example, wait until afterwards. Is there any value in having a discussion about streamlining the process across the country?
I think streamlining the process across the country would be absolutely disastrous, because then you're going to add layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy on a process that's already really complicated, and that each state not only has their set of laws about, but established practices that voters in each state are accustomed to. And I honestly think centralizing elections in a federal manner would really just upend the whole process. And then really you would have, because really the interest in the federal election piece would be the presidential and federal elections. And then you'd have state elections, just like now we have state elections, and then you have down ballot elections that are mostly conducted by the county. It's already, a little bit, there's separation there. And I just think it would be really confusing and add a lot of unneeded bureaucracy if we added then again a federal layer. There already is federal oversight. There's the Election Assistance Commission. There's federal voting rights laws that all states have to maintain and enforce. So I haven't heard any discussions. I think you would see most secretaries of state rebelling against that kind of proposal.
So talking about any kind of proposals or lessons learned out of all of this, is there anything from the way that balloting is conducted to the way that the count is protected on the backside, anything at all that you think that you'd be recommending to the legislature by way of any kind of legislative fixes or anything on your wish list for, in the light of what has transpired in this election?
I think certainly we do have a list of legislative priorities that we've been putting together just as we, go through this election. So I don't think any of them were exactly specific to what happened on Tuesday, but we probably will be having a discussion about pens, maybe in the election procedures manual. But yeah, certainly there are processes we want to clean up, and I think it kind of took getting an election under our belt to have a really clear picture of what some of those are. But we'll definitely be recommending some changes that will mostly improve efficiency in terms of conduction of elections.
Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck in the coming days.
Thank you so much.